Hello everyone and welcome back to the Arsenal Pass YouTube channel. It is Hayden here, and today I'm talking about ProQuest Season 3 and diving into the decks that you should be playing for this ProQuest season. Well, at least in my opinion. I'm going to talk through some of the strongest decks in the format from my testing, the list that I would be looking to if you want to play one of these heroes, talking through maybe meta considerations why you should or shouldn't play these, as well as, a little bit about the deck list and things you should be considering. Now, I hope these will help whether you're playing this hero or whether you are looking at the meta snapshot and trying to understand what is going to show up for your ProQuest this coming weekend. Now, we are the week of ProQuest. Players are going to be battling it out around the world this coming weekend to punch their ticket to the Pro Tour number 1 in the USA 2023. As well as that, we of course have 3 weeks. So I'm going to give a bit of a meta snapshot as well. I've rolled up some data from all the things we've had so far, the December season with Dynasty so far. We've got some great stats from Talishar. We're going to dive into that to start with, give you a big sort of just snapshot picture of what this meta is likely to look like, what you're likely to walk into this coming weekend. And based on that, I'm going to talk through 7 heroes, deck lists that I think you should look at in preparation for this upcoming ProQuest season. Now, if you enjoy the videos that we do here at Arsenal Pass, we really appreciate it if you go and drop us a sub, drop us a like on this video, big old thumbs up, and even in the comments, let us know what you are planning to play for ProQuest Season 3. What do you think of the deck list that I've presented here? Are you looking at potentially playing one of these? Do you have a completely different hero in mind? And what is your plan for this upcoming ProQuest season? Now, with that said, let's get into it and take a look at exactly what this metagame is probably going to look like for ProQuest season in week 1. Now, with Dynasty releasing post the World Championships in November, we didn't get a lot of time before the end of the year to see really high-level competitive class constructed featuring the new Dynasty cards. But what we did get was 5 events around the world, which did grant PTIs, more competitive events that I think you could start to say could indicate what the meta is going to look like heading into this ProQuest season. Now, I'm bringing up on this slide data from 3 of these events. Couldn't get access to all 5 events data, but 3 of these events that show the total meta breakdown. And you can see at the top of the list, Dash. Obviously, a lot of new tools for Dash, 11% of the meta. Interestingly, Reinar, same amount of representation in the meta from these 3 events, 11%, Iyslander 10%, Bravo, then Fi, Lexi, and you can see 12 of the 17 heroes in class constructed here. Bottom 5, Bolton, Livia, Katsu, Arachne, Azalea, only made up 1% each, basically, of this meta share. But I think what you can take away from it, from these 3 events with the total meta data, is really wide spread of heroes, which I think you can generally expect with a new set. But the good thing is as well is that these PTI events and Battle Hardens, they're pretty close to what you expect from a ProQuest. ProQuests are generally a bit more varied in the meta because players play the decks they like or the decks they've worked on or the decks they've owned. And that's the same with PTIs and Battle Hardens generally. The meta is a bit more diverse, and this meta is really diverse, especially in the first few weeks of Dynasty like we see here. Now I'm going to flick to the next slide, which shows us the top 8 percentages. Now you can see a bit of a rearrange here. Basically across all 5 events, what are the heroes converting to in terms of top 8s? And you can see Dash at the top of the list there. It was 11% in the meta. When you look at all these 5 events in total, it is 18% of total top 8s across these 5 PTI Battle Hardened events with Dynasty prior to 2023. And then the other thing that starts to shift is you see some of these heroes that would be regarded as probably tier 1, Fi up there, 15% of total top 8 wins, really shifting up. Iyslander there as well, 10%. And then Bravo at 10%. Reinar still sticking up though, which is interesting. And then Lexi. Now, what is kind of the takeaway from this? Well, it is a small sample size, so we do have to be careful. It's only 3 and then 5 events showing us the starter. But what I think it is showing alongside a really diverse meta is that we're starting to see some of the decks that were previously strong still continue to be strong, as well as the new kind of, I guess, the aggro deck or the deck that people are looking towards in terms of Dash with these upgrades, Pulse Wave Harpoon, BIOS Update, Hanabi Blaster, etc., the Crankshaft package, which is really interesting. What I think when you look at these heroes as well, you could say 2 aggro decks, 2 disruptive decks, and then 2 kind of off-meta decks that you might not expect that are trying to prey on the meta in certain ways, which is really cool to see. But a lot of heroes with good representation here, and above 8%, we've got 8 heroes showing up in these top 8s. When you look at wins, Dash also took out the most wins, took out 2 wins, Iyslander a win, Reinar a win, and Lexi a win. So everyone on that top row, representation and in terms of top 8 conversion, also grabbing the wins, which I think shows that we are starting to see some meta players really shape up. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is we're going to take a look at some data from Talishar, which is a lot bigger sample size, but obviously isn't at being played at the event level that these events are with these PTI and Battle Hardened events, but I think is really, really interesting and leads on from what we've just seen prior to 2023 with these events. Next, I'm going to bring up some data from Talishar, and this is from December only. And I think the reason to look at this is that we get a full month snapshot post Dynasty, and we're only 5 days removed, 6 days removed from the end of that month as well, as we head into ProQuest season, as people start to tune and test their decks. But I think it's a really interesting snapshot to look at. It's 70,000 games in this data set, so it's a really wide data set. And this first lot of data I'm looking at is heroes played. What are the heroes seeing the most play? Because often that's going to translate to heroes you're going to see the most play at your ProQuest. So first up, Dash. I think not really surprised. We saw a lot of Dash in the last data set, in those ProQuest, those PTI rather, and Battle Hardened events, and all these new tools. A lot of people trying out Dash. You can see it's 10% of total games played. Next up is Reiner. Very similar to what we saw with the top 2 decks played in these ProQuest, or these PTI rather, and Battle Hardened events, the same as we've been seeing on Talishar for the past month, which I think is a really interesting takeaway as well. And then third, we've got Fi. So again, we're following a really similar trajectory here. 8.3% of games played on Talishar through that month with Fi. And then next up is Dromai. Now this is where I think it starts to get interesting, and it deviates from what we saw with the Battle Hardened data. And I'll talk about this at the end when I talk about sort of takeaways from all these data sets that we have. Then it's Iyslander, 11,600 games. And then it's Bravo, rounding it out. So those are the top 6 heroes played in the month of December on Talishar in classic constructed games. And I think some really interesting sort of looks there. Now, let's move on and take a look at win rate data and some takeaways from all this info that we have. All right, now this is an interesting one. Win rate starts to tell us a bit of a different story compared to decks played, and I think there's some really good takeaways here. But first up is Dromai. Dromai has the highest win rate through December on Talishar, 56% win rate, actually equal with our second, which is Ultim. Less games played, it was lower on that list of games played, but also a 56% win rate. It was only 5% of games played. After those two at 56%, we have Bravo at 55%. So the Guardian's really showing out with strong win rates. Followed by that is Briar, same as Bravo on that 55% win rate. And then we go to Fi, 55% win rate also, and was on this list the most played deck, after Dash and Reiner, like we saw, it was the third most played. And on this list of win rates, it's actually the most played. And then we go to Iyslander. Again, 7.6% of games played at 53% win rate. And then lastly, Lexi. So what should we take away from all this data? What is the so what of all this data presented across Talishar, across these Battle Hardened PTI events? Well, I think the biggest takeaway from me is, first of all, a diverse meta, which we talked about. I think you can expect a pretty diverse meta for week 1 of ProQuest at least. Probably all 3 weeks, I think. 3 weeks isn't that much time for a format to really evolve and move through. We've seen it previously. This is a shorter ProQuest season, and because of how diverse this meta is looking to start with, I think you aren't going to see move it as quick and sort of 1 or 2 decks really dominate like they have in previous ProQuest seasons. The next takeaway for me is that there's going to be a lot of Dash and there's going to be a lot of Fi at these events, and Fi in particular I think is going to do really well. It's top of the list, close to top of the charts on decks played across both of these sort of data sets. It's also converted really well across both of these. Dash, on the other hand, I think obviously hasn't converted as well when you look at the Talishar stats. And I think you can caveat this a little bit and maybe say people are trying with a lot of the tools that are available. Maybe they're trying these Mechanoid decks. Maybe they're trying an RB Crankshaft decks. Maybe they're trying more traditional decks. And it does have a lower win rate. But what I would say is that it's a good aggro deck. It's going to show up. It's going to be a deck that's there. I don't think it's going to show up as much as Fi. I think we'll probably see those shift, and I think Dash we'll see less play than Fi. That could depend on your meta though. Other sort of takeaways I think outside of those 2 decks and their representation is that we're still going to see quite a bit of Iyslander. You see it has a pretty reasonable win rate, but we do know that deck is harder to play. It's one that if you haven't checked out the podcast from this past week that Brendan and I did, it is a deck that requires a lot of reps, and I think people will shy away from it for that reason because it can be quite punishing. Disruption decks, Guardian decks in particular with Ultim and Bravo, both really strong win rates on Talishar. Bravo, strong win rates at these previous events this last month. Bravo is going to show up and I think is a pretty reasonable option. Reiner, I think we're going to see this drop off. I think as people have discovered what this format's about, it's got more aggressive. I think you can tell, I think the win rate on Talishar is really indicative of what's happened with Reiner. I don't think the deck is as strong to compete and it's going to drop away. Then when we look at sort of these 2 last decks I want to talk about, which is Dromai and Lexi. Now, Lexi is sat there in a really good spot as this disruptive deck that has a pretty good sort of matchup spread into some of the heroes above it when you look at representation and sort of the win rate and top 8 conversion data. And Dromai, while it didn't look like it performed as well in that PTI Battle Hardened scene, its stats on Talishar tell a really important story. 56% win rate, equal highest win rate with Ultim. Tells you with a deck that's not super easy to play that there is something there with Dromai, and I think we're going to see Dromai creep up in playability through this ProQuest season, especially if Iyslander is one of the top decks. Will Fi and Will Fire keep it down? What is the dash matchup like? Those are the things that people are going to have to consider. So those are the data sets that I have for ProQuest Season 3, heading into it with the early Dynasty meta from these PTI and Battle Hardened events, plus all this 70,000+ games of Talishar data, which I think tell a pretty interesting story. Now let's get into it and look at some of the decks that I would recommend based on all the things we just talked about, plus my own experience in testing. The decks I'm presenting in this video is the decks that I think are the ones that you should be playing for ProQuest Season 3. Aren't necessarily in order of what I think I would play in particular, but I do think they're roughly in order of the heroes that I think are the strongest options, especially for week 1. And we're going to start with Fire. Now, Fire, I think, is in a particularly good spot, especially in a wide meta. I think a proactive strategy is a really good option for week 1 of ProQuest. The deck has these really explosive elements with Pouncing Links, Art of War, combo-esque sort of draws, plus the ability to, match out other matchups with Mask of Momentum, for instance. Now, the list I'm going to bring up in front of me is Pablo Pintor's list from 5th place at the Calling in San Jose, and I think this is probably something I pretty similar would go for myself. It's the list that I've used quite a bit in testing as a sort of gauntlet deck. It's the one I've been most impressed with. I know there's versions out there with things like Ember Flame Wave that Rob Catton played in top 8 or played 2 top 8 of World Championships. I think that is also a good option, but I think from my testing, this is the list I would lean towards. And some of the cards I want to talk about and pick out are the options to have 6 Belittle. I think that's really important if you're expecting Icelanders to show up in your meta. I would definitely make sure you stick with those cards. I would even consider maybe playing more energy potions if you think that you're going to see more of these, more Icelanders in your meta. Outside of that, I think, keeping disruption elements like Command and Conquer is really important. I like that Pablo just plays the 1 Salt the Wound. I think you could potentially bump it up to 2 to make sure you don't miss, but that card kind of sucks to draw a lot of time. Even though it is a yellow, you much want to see just reds and blues. But obviously a great search up on a massive Pouncing Links turn. So I think overall, I think this list is really tight. Obviously, Pablo is a Pro Tour champion. He knows what he's doing. And moving on into Dynasty from the World Championships, there's not too much that's changed for Fire, right? So this is the list that I would probably stick to pretty closely. And again, I think Fire is a great option for particularly week 1, but especially if you're looking for something that's just super aggressive, still really, really good, probably one of the 2 or 3 best decks in the format, and is going to serve you well throughout the 3 weeks and cause your opponents a lot of problems and ask the question. I always think when you head into these events, you want to ask a question, especially when the format is looking so diverse. When it comes to matchups for Fire as well, I think Fire has a pretty good matchup spread, but particularly if you're expecting metas with Iyslander, Dromai, obviously really strong win rates on Talishar, as we've seen people playing those decks. Fire is a great option. An aggro wide field, you don't particularly know what aggro decks people are going to show up with. I think Fire is great. Fire also really punishes just sort of decks that aren't as refined. And, that package of Belittle is just so, so good into decks that want to try and disrupt you. Next up, keeping with the aggro theme, the hero that I would recommend looking at is Dash. Now, I think Dash is in a particularly good spot, obviously, with the tools it's got. And we just saw from the data before that you're going to expect to see a reasonable amount of Dash. And the top 2 heroes are the top 2 heroes that we saw in particularly, win rate or top 8, rate in those Battle Hardened PTI data. And I think for good reason in those events. I think it's going to continue through because they ask questions just like Fire. Dash can do the same thing. Now, I am going to bring up 2 different lists of Dash, and I'll talk through why that is. But basically, I think Dash is a really interesting hero because you can play it in any sort of way. You can play it as a super hyper aggressive deck. You can play it in a hybrid sort of way with a sideboard package of defensive cards with an aggro shell, and you can even play more of a slower sort of grindy control-based Dash deck that looks to set up that item lock for the late game. Now, I think where I would lean to, and if you haven't checked that out already, I did do a deck tech on this particular Dash deck, which is this Hanabi Hyperdriver Crankshaft boost aggro deck as the shell, or the main deck shell rather, and it just wants to be the most aggressive deck in the format. The most damage dealt out of a deck, raw damage, is what this is aiming to do. And I think this is a great option if you're looking, again, a wide format week 1, and I think you can go in and ask the question with this deck. Hanabi Blaster is a particularly powerful piece of weaponry from the new set, I think, as well as this Hyperdriver plan where you can effectively play pitchless. But you can go check more of that out in the video if you want to know more about this deck. But I think it's a great option, particularly for week 1. Now, the other option I'll show is Matt Rogers' Dash deck that he put out on his latest piece of content, and I think it's a really good option for more of a hybrid. I wouldn't play a control-based strategy in this format because I think there's too many aggro decks, and I think it's too slow, and I think you can get punished for it, especially, again, with a really wide meta. I would look more something like this. If you want to hedge, maybe you're expecting more things like Iyslander, maybe even more Guardians, then I would look to this build instead of the build that I showcased, which I think is going to do better into a field full of other aggro decks and, decks where maybe people haven't refined as much, people bringing some ranges, people bringing some things like Rhinar, etc. I think the Hanabi deck is really good, but into a meta that you can target a bit more, especially where you might expect a bit more of the slower grindier matchups, I would go for something more like this mat list. Third hero on my list might be a little bit more surprising, and that is Lexi Livewire. Now, the reason that I think Lexi is a great choice for the ProQuest season is basically the two decks that we just talked about. Lexi is in a really good spot to come in as this disruptor to quite an aggressive early meta, and still be a deck that can ask its own questions, which is what I like about Lexi. You know, some of the things that I don't love about really heavy ice ultims in the past is, yeah, they might be great into aggro decks, but they can potentially be a little bit softer to decks that don't really care about disruption and just want to, you know, go and do their own plan. Whereas Lexi still has the ability to disrupt plans and go to face with damage, which I think is really, really important. So Lexi, I think, is in a particularly good spot. Now, the list I'm going to share is a list that I've actually been working on during testing. This is a list that I was using for testing for a couple of weeks, a deck that I really liked and tuned. It is definitely aimed at the aggressive decks. It's aimed at, you know, playing into these aggressive and mid-range decks, as well as having, you know, a reasonable time into Iyslander as well. Although I think that is a tougher matchup than if you play something like the more fuseless, really heavy zero cost list. This list does feature cards like Frostfang and Icy Encounter, which I think are fantastic for having these non-arrow hands that disrupt aggro decks, especially when you maybe need to block out because you've sort of fallen back on disruption. And then you can play like a 2-card hand or a 3-card hand. One of my favorite plays with a deck like this is being able to flip your Frostfang, play an arrow out of hand for go again, and then play your Frostfang out with your last 2 resources from your blue that you pitch, and just present a good 10-11 damage turn and disrupt depending if it's Icy Encounter and what area you play. But I really do like that kind of play pattern, and I think this Lexi deck in particular can do it well. If you are expecting more of maybe an Iyslander and Guardian meta, then I might look to some of these other Lexi lists, but I think if you were heading into a meta where you expect a lot of fire, you expect a lot of dash, maybe even expect a decent amount of Briar, then I think this Lexi list in particular is a fantastic option. It's why it's so high on my list for ProQuest Season 3, especially in Week 1. Next up on my list is what many consider to be the best hero in Classic Constructed right now, and while I don't necessarily disagree with them, I think there's some caveats to Iyslander, and it's the reason that it's a little bit lower down on my list. A couple of things. I think Iyslander is a much harder deck to play than the decks above it on this list. I also think that it has a massive target on its back coming into this first weekend of ProQuest and this format. I think it's going to see less play than a lot of people expect, but I think that could be region and sort of local meta dependent. Iyslander is a hero that is super punishing. You make a couple of mistakes with when you pivot the game from your attack actions to your non-attack actions. You have your disruption sort of set up at the wrong time, or you play it into the wrong cards. You sideboard incorrectly. You make a wrong decision on the card in your arsenal, and one or two of those can just take the game away from you completely. On the flip side, Fi, which I think is sort of maybe tier 1 if you want to call it that, alongside Iyslander, I think that is just a much better pick, despite also having a target on its back, because it always asks the question. It has these combo potential sort of explosive draws, and it's a bit more straightforward to play, although there is still a lot of play to fire. So Iyslander is on my list. It's still pretty high. I think it is a good pick, but I think people are coming out with picks like Dromai. I think people are coming out with, you know, their 5 decks with 6 belittles ready to combat Iyslander. I think people are coming out here with, you know, dash builds that, you know, are going to consider Iyslander and not just be pure aggressive builds. So it could be a tricky first week for Iyslander. I think as the format goes along, Iyslander could be in a really good spot and might rise up this list for me. It's a hero that I'm definitely considering playing for my ProQuest. I think it just depends. Now, in terms of this list, I've brought up Brody Spurlock's list from the PTI event that he won. It's not too dissimilar from Michael Hamilton's. I think the only real change is that Brody has gone to 3 hypothermia, which I massively agree with in this meta. Definitely do it because of dash. It's so good into dash, as well as things like Briar as well. So I would go to what is effectively this list that Brody's put here. And yeah, if you are looking at a meta that's going to be full of Guardians and not Dromai and not so much Five, a lot of Briar, then Iyslander is a hero I would look at. It's also a hero that I think gets better as the meta starts to shape up, but we'll see how things go. Rounding out my top 5 is another aggressive hero in the form of Briar. Now, the reason my top 5 heroes to play for ProQuest season is so dominated by aggressive heroes is because I'm a really big fan at this kind of level of play, of organized play, this kind of tier 2 where events are a lot wider with what people will play. They are open entry format. I think what you want to be doing is you want to be asking the question. Unless there's a by far powerful way sort of control deck that is just so good you should be playing, Iyslander might be close to that, but I think you want to be asking the question, and Briar is another deck that asks the question so well, has these amazing channel mount heroic turns, it has access to really powerful pieces of equipment, and is just in what I think a really good spot. in this meta, especially if Iyslander in your particular meta is going to see less play. So if you know that you're expecting less Iyslander, I think Briar might be the aggro deck that I would bring because of the explosivity of the turns. It'd be that or the dash sort of Hanabi deck that I showcase. Now, this list I'm going to bring up is my current Briar list, the list that I've been using in testing, the list that I've tweaked post World Championship, and I quite like. Now, I'm a big fan of Spellbound Creepers because of the interaction. Now, there is other lists out there with Snapdragon Scalers. I would say if you're going to play Snapdragon Scalers, I would move away from the explosive growth, but I think the explosive growth package right now is in a phenomenal spot with the amount of dash and fire running around these aggressive decks. It's effectively a mini Channel Mount Heroic. It's Channel Mount Heroics 4 through 6. So I really like this list right now with access to Spellbound Creepers, which helps enable the explosive growth package, but also just some ridiculous turns. Flashing out a Channel Mount Heroic, flashing out a Force of Nature, flashing out a Amulet of Earth to pump up your Force of Nature attacks, etc., so on, so on. There's so much this deck can do. It has a lot of play to it as well. And I just think, again, a aggressive deck that asks the question with Rosetta Thorn in it, I think you can't go wrong with Briar. So safely in my top 5 picks right now, especially if you're expecting few sort of Iyslander in your meta, then I think this is probably the aggro deck I would lean towards. Now for these videos, I would usually just do a top 5, but this meta is really diverse and I don't want to take away from some of the other decks that I think are really good options in this meta. If you're looking for something that isn't an aggro deck, obviously I've featured a lot of aggressive decks here, and is an Iyslander effectively. The next one up on my list is Dromai. Now, Dromai is one that I think has a lot of tools. I think the deck is strong, but I do think the hero suffers from a few weaknesses, and the main one being Fire. So the reason it's so low down on my list is basically because of Fire. While I do think Dromai is really powerful, I think it has great game into heroes like Ultim, heroes like Iyslander in particular, and is actually not too bad into a lot of the aggressive decks, the Rune Blades in particular. It is pretty bad against Fire, in my opinion, even with these more aggressive decks. Now, that is the list I'm going to show you. I'm going to bring up Jeremy Langevin's deck from Battle Hardened Philadelphia, where he came 5th, and this is a red line Dromai deck, which is what I think I would be looking at right now to help combat potential Fire metas. But again, I probably wouldn't play this deck. I probably wouldn't play Dromai if I expected a lot of Fire, but any ProQuest you go to is going to have Fire in it, so I think you want to have a build that can combat and can actually play with Fire, and this is what I think Jeremy has with this list. I really like these red line lists. We saw Demamata take it to the semifinals of the finals, right, of the Goliath Gauntlet back before Worlds with this more red line version, more aggressive version, and this is what I like. Expelling some of these larger, expensive dragons for just a good core, and Red Hot is super, super powerful. I really like that card a lot. So this is probably the list that I would look at. And again, if you're looking at a heavy Fire meta, it's probably not a hero I'd look at. But if you're looking at a meta that has, a lot of Icelanders, it's still quite a wide meta, a lot of maybe Guardian as well. I do think that Dromai is a really good hero to pick up and take to these ProQuests, but do get some reps in because it isn't the most straightforward, especially some of the in-games against decks like Guardian. All right, rounding out my list, and the second of these bonus 2 heroes effectively is Bravo. Now, I think Bravo is not a hero that I would personally be taking to an event like ProQuest because of the matchup into Iyslander and even Dromai. And I don't even necessarily myself believe that the aggressive matches are super favorable for Bravo, but I will admit that they are pretty good, especially, matchups into Fire, and your matchup into Briar, I think, is pretty good as well. So I do think it is a pretty good option if you expect an almost exclusively aggressive meta. I think Bravo is a great deck to pick up. I would preface to play something like Lexi, I think, in that sort of meta, because I think it has great disruption elements and asks really great questions. Whereas I think Bravo, its questions and its disruption are all tied into one. And I think that can be a little bit awkward. So I would lean more towards Lexi, but I do think that Bravo has a spot in this meta, despite what Brendan says on the podcast. I know he's a big Ultim fan. I think Bravo is the better pick right now from a Guardian standpoint. And the list I'm going to show you is Patrick Requejo's from the Calling in San Jose. I don't think too much has changed. You can look at some of the more updated lists with the new cards. There's the new blue from Dynasty that I think can fit into the deck. But I really like Patrick's list because of the sort of the core of what he has, which is these disruptive elements with Choke Slams, Command and Conquers, Crush the Weeks. And I think if you're going to take Bravo to a ProQuest this coming weekend or any of the next 2 weekends, this is what sort of core you want, the ability to really disrupt these aggressive decks. So I would look to Patrick's deck in particular. I think it's really well-rounded. I like the sideboard options with unmovables for the mirror, etc. So this is probably what I would look to play if I was going to pick up and play Bravo myself. Now, Again, if you are expecting a lot of Iyslander and even Dromai, etc., I would stay away from Bravo. But if you are familiar with Guardian, you like playing Guardian, you are expecting a pretty aggressive meta, then I do think Bravo is a pretty good option, particularly for week 1 of this ProQuest season. All right, that is my preview for ProQuest Season 3 and the decks that I think you should be playing for this upcoming ProQuest season, as well as a massive sort of data dump snapshot of what I think the meta is going to be. Just to recap it a little bit for you, if you're still thinking, what does this all mean? What should I actually play this weekend? Well, I do think it depends on what you expect your local meta to be like, but there's some big extrapolations that I think we're going to see across the world, across the metas, which is a pretty aggressive week 1 and a reasonably aggressive total ProQuest season. Now, that is not out of the ordinary, but in particular, I think there's a lot of really good aggressive options from Dash to Fi to Briar. You know, even Viscerai and Lexi decks that can be aggressive, I think, are reasonable options, but those top 3 in particular, we're going to see. I think that puts, you know, these disruptive decks in a really good spot, particularly Lexi. I really like Lexi for this format, but it might not be everyone's sort of cup of tea, especially if you don't have the reps on it. I think Iyslander, if you do have the reps on it, is a very good choice as well. So those are the options I would take. I would always default, if you're in doubt, to ask the question. What is the deck that will ask the question? That's why Fire is still top of my list for this ProQuest season if you're looking for a deck to take. But I hope that helps give some insight on meta expectations and what you should take to this ProQuest season. Now, if you do like what we're doing here at Arsenal Pass, please do give us a sub, drop a like on this video, drop a comment. You playing any of these decks? Are you not playing them? Why not? Or why are you playing them? Maybe you're playing a different hero that I didn't feature. Now, I do think all the heroes in this current format actually have, well, most of the heroes in this format have some viability to them. It is really about how you build for your expected metagame. You know, heroes, I didn't put Kano on this list. I'm a massive fan of Kano and do think it has some really good potential in this current meta if I don't expect Dash to show up. So, you know, every hero is viable. You don't have to listen to my top 7 heroes, but I have put these in some sort of order of what I think is a pretty good pick if you are looking at what decks you should take to this ProQuest season. Until the next video, we'll see you next time.